Okay, so thinking about what we just saw, can you answer any one of these? Why would we use it? How does it? What's the difference between a database and RDBMS? And how is SQL Server different from Access? Richard?
Speed. It's a lot faster managing and processing data through SQL Server.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so it's considered a high-performance database for sure. What are some of the other reasons to use it, Alex?
It works well with ASP.NET.
That's right. It's typically the usual choice. If we're going to build an application from scratch, if .NET's going to be our development tool, then most of the time, much more often than not, SQL Server is going to serve as the back end. They play well together, just like typically MySQL is the database choice for PHP development. Give a couple other important reasons why we might use it. Yeah, but why would we choose SQL Server as opposed to choosing something else?
All the features it
I think it's free, isn't it?
It is not free.
Oh, no?
has. It's straightforward to use.
It is pretty straightforward to use. He talked about hosting. This was a big reason. What did he say about SQL Server and third-party hosting solutions? Right, that's right, Robbie. So most hosting companies will, virtually every hosting company out there is going to offer you MySQL. Many of them will only offer you MySQL, but if they offer you another choice, it will be SQL Server. If you want to run a web application, you want it to run on Oracle, you're basically going to have to set up your own server and pay for an Oracle license, which is thousands of dollars to run and install. Whereas most hosting companies, so for example, here's one that I do a lot of hosting with. And we can see in their hosting plans, basically they give you two choices of a database. So if we look at their Windows web hosting, basically you get MySQL or you get so we get SQL Server options or MySQL options, basically. So those are, so you get both. Whereas you won't really find any other kind of database available. Now, in terms of the cost, he mentioned this, the licensing cost is actually very, very high for this. So the nice thing is, if you host with a third-party host, the host has already paid for the SQL Server license, and in effect, they're just charging you to rent space. For you to get your own license is extremely expensive. If we have a look. Now this is for 2008.
You gotta have the date when you do a search. Search Google. And you use Google. Yahoo does not do search.
It just doesn't do it. It's not what it's meant to do at all.
So let's see. So you guys can get this, for example, on DreamSpark. So this version is 25. Well, here's the standard version. From the Microsoft Store, this is $3,100 US for the standard version. So you've got this available. All of the versions are available on DreamSpark. So if you're running your own machine, you'll need to install a version of SQL Server. Now there are more expensive versions, the Professional and the Enterprise. I think the Enterprise is about $6,000.
That's not too bad.
Or maybe, actually, that might be the Professional. So you may as well get it and download it from DreamSpark. There is also an Express version that's available for free, but the Express version doesn't include the Management Studio tool, which you need to download and install separately. If you download and install one of the versions from DreamSpark, then you get the Management Studio tool as well. Okay. So you'll want this. One of the other things that he talks about is that it integrates really well with all other Microsoft products, and not only ASP.NET, but if you want to do integration with Office products like PowerPoint, like bring your data into something like PowerPoint or Excel, it's really easy to do. SharePoint is one of the other products that he mentions. He also talked about the difference between SQL Server and database like Access. Some of you have probably played around with Access before. How are they different? I mean, the data structure is pretty similar. The tables, the keys, all of that stuff is the same, but how are they different? Yeah, okay, so the queries are somewhat different. Access contains some functionality that he mentions SQL Server doesn't have. He says there's one main piece of functionality that people are surprised that SQL Server doesn't have, but something like Access does. Did anybody catch what that was?
Like a visual way to edit.
Yeah, there's no front end at all to SQL Server. It's just the raw tables and the management system, whereas with Access, not only can you create related tables, but you can build input forms and you can build reports as well. So there's no user interface component at all. That's really up to us to build, whether it's a desktop app, a web app, or a mobile app. So if you're on the lab computers, SQL Server is installed already. And if you have your own machine, then for sure you want to download and install one of the versions from DreamSpark. It doesn't really matter. The lab computers have 2008. My own machine that I'm going to use in class, I also have 2008. There's probably no reason not to get 2014 if you're going to get a version from DreamSpark. May as well get a current version. If you're going to install SQL Server yourself, you can accept all of the defaults when you go through the installation, but you'll get prompted to enter an administrator password. The default administrator username is SA, which stands for System Admin. It won't allow you to configure the admin account with a blank password. So whatever password you enter when you configure, make sure you make a note of it somewhere in a text file or in an email to yourself. So you have that password. Because if you don't have that password, you obviously won't be able to log into the server to manage your databases, and you also won't be able to get your web applications to talk to the database. So make sure that you write down your password somewhere, make an electronic note of it. So your login will be SA for system admin and whatever password you choose. If you're using the lab computers, we don't need the credential. You can actually log in to the SQL Server on the lab machines using your Windows login. It's also set up that we can set up SQL Server to use Windows authentication. So as long as you've authenticated through on the network, you can get into the database. So what we want to do first is just kind of play around a little bit with SQL Server, get familiar with the interface. So I'll show you where to find it. We'll set databases up on Azure, and then we'll try and connect to our Azure databases through Management Studio. Last week we had some issues connecting to Azure through the firewall. I've spoken to IT and they say that they've resolved them. So we'll see. If not, we have a backup. We can always just install and work on the local copies if we can't connect to our Azure. It's no big deal. So what you'll want, if you're on a lab computer, under Computer Studies, you'll see Microsoft SQL Server 2008. So if you want to open that up, R2 is just an update. So most of my actual applications are under the R2. I'm not sure under on the lab computers if you have both the R2 and the 2008. The application we want is SQL Server Management Studio. So this is much like MySQL Workbench, but it's much richer and more robust in terms of functionality. So everything you would do in Workbench, we would do through Management Studio, but we have a lot of other features and functions in here as well. I'm not sure if it's under 2008 or 2008 R2 on the lab computers. Now we actually can access SQL Server databases directly through Visual Studio as well. I'll show you how to do that, but the functionality through Visual Studio is much more limited. So some people like having it all in Visual Studio. They don't need two different applications open. Whenever I'm developing, I always use both Management Studio for managing the database and then Visual Studio for doing the web application end. If you're on the lab computer, here are the credentials. The server name is localhost /ACPAC. ACPAC is actually accounting software that's installed on all the college PCs for the finance students and accounting students, and it uses SQL Server as the back end. So that's why they've installed it. For authentication, if you're on the lab computer, just change the authentication from SQL Server to Windows, and you'll be able to just hit connect and you'll be logged in. You don't have to supply separate credentials on the lab machines. If you're on your own machine, then typically you'll log in. The server is just local in brackets, or you can use 127.0.0.1. And then you need to log in with your SQL Server authentication, which typically is SA is the login, and whatever password you created at the time you installed SQL Server. So what we'll do, we'll create a simple database just with a table in here, and I'll show you kind of, we can play around a little bit and look at some of the functionality. Then we can try setting up a database on Azure and seeing if we can connect through here. So as he said in the video, this is really an entire management system. There are a collection of databases. So if I want to see what's here in my databases, if I expand, here are some databases I've created. If you're on the SQL Server, if you expand databases, you'll see a bunch of ACPAC databases. So these are used by some of the accounting software. So not only do we have individual databases, we can manage security, so setting up additional logins and also creating roles and permissions. We can set up cryptography for encryption. We've got replications. Anybody have an idea what database replication is? Anybody heard that term before? Kyle?
It'd be like somewhere to recover back to.
You're close. Replication is used for syncing databases. So we can run a database on different servers and have it sync. Or we can have users that have local offline copies of databases, and when they get connected to the network, they can sync up with a master copy. So that feature's built in. We've got other kinds of management tools in here as well. So we can distribute, we can do security policies, maintenance plans for things like backup, logging, sending email, distributed transactions for load balancing. So there's an awful lot here. Much like ASP.NET is like driving an SUV of web development, well, SQL Server is like driving an SUV when it comes to database management. So inside an individual database, I'll just open one that I've created. So we get not only the tables, I mean, this would be similar to what you'd see in MySQL Workbench. So we've got a list of tables which we can expand. We can create database diagrams as we can do in Workbench. So basically we can use the tool to create ERDs. We've got views and queries. Storage, we can write custom functions. So inside of programmability, we have things like database triggers. Have you guys played with those at all in other classes? Yeah, with what kind of database? With DB2. Okay, so we've got triggers here. We can set up rules and stored procedures as well. So if we want our SQL commands to live inside the database and be compiled in there rather than existing within our application, we can manage all that stuff here. So we'll go ahead and we'll make a new database. We'll just create a simple table. We can just play around with some of the functionality. So to create a database, it's pretty simple through here. If I just select databases, right click and choose new database.
Why are yours a little different?
So we give it a name. And your file path, I'm not sure if it'll be the same or different. This is the default. 2 physical files get created every time we build a new database.
It's going to be a screencast here.
Yes. So it'll create a file called test.mdf. That's the actual database. It also creates a log file. It appends on an underscore log and gives it an LDF file. And these will get created by default in this folder, Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server. I'll just open it up.
So we should leave it at the default, right?
Yep, you can leave it at the default. So I think it'll put them in here inside of data. So what we're going to do, so you can see the twin, the MDFs. So here I've got, for example, a 24 meg MDF file, and then it's got a 13 meg log file. We'll create a database, we'll create a table, we'll query it. We'll also look at how we can do backups through here. So I'll just say OK and create my new database. Doesn't take long. So you can create a new one on these servers. If you're on the lab computer, it'll just get wiped out after class. So now we've got a test MDF. So it's actually 2 megs by default, just with nothing in it. An empty SQL Server database is going to be 2 megabytes. So now I have a new database. And we can actually create a table just through the, we can write an SQL command, or we can just go in through this little editor. If I right-click tables and choose new table, so we get a screen that looks something like this. So we actually can just create, let's say I want to put in a column called ID and give it a data type. To turn it into a primary key, I can just click on that column, and here's a set primary key button. Bang, now we've got a primary key. And if we want to make that an auto-incrementing field, I can just go down into the properties of that column. If I expand where it says identity specification, there's a field here that says is identity. So if we'll change that from no to yes. So it'll increment by ones, and by default, if we want it to start at another number, let's say we want it to start at 1,000 instead, so the first record in there is 1,000, we just change the identity seed, and that way our records will start at 1,000 rather than 1.
Could you use that if you have a database that's already at 1,000 records, start at 1,100?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, we can set that at any number. And I'll just maybe put in a column for name.
How did you make it primary?
There's a button right here. So I clicked on that column. Actually, you can right-click it and choose Set Primary Key, or you can click the little key button on the toolbar.
Where's this 1,000?
That's down here under Identity Specification. I set the identity seed. So scroll down in the properties. So the data types are similar to what you would expect, what you are used to with MySQL. So we'll set a 50-character
It's
name column.
not letting me.
You have to turn identity specification to true first. Is identity. Look at the properties I have here on my screen. I changed is identity, defaults to no, you have to change that to yes first. Once you change that to yes, then you can set the increment and the seed. Now, we could write an SQL create table statement. I generally don't create tables with SQL scripts. I find this is easier. It's less work. It's more idiot-proof to just click. So now when we save our table, it'll prompt us. So we'll just call this, we can just call it table 1. Good descriptive name. Right. So I'll close that table. So I'll show you, we'll look at the query editor. So again, this is somewhat similar to my SQL Workbench. If I click on New Query, you know, it also has the same kind of code prompts that Visual Studio has. Although I'm not sure why it's not. Okay, so no records. We can insert. Let's say we'll just insert a record. Oh, here the code prompts are coming up now. So when I say insert into it finds table 1, it recognizes the columns and prompts me. Also, before I run my statement, let's say I make a mistake. If I make an SQL error, like Workbench, it already prompts me. And before I execute my SQL, if I click the parse button, it checks my syntax before it actually executes. So it gives me a chance to pre-test my code for errors. And it tells me what line number. I don't think you have the line numbers on, but you can turn them on. You probably don't have the line numbers here on the left. You turn them on in Management Studio in the same way you do in Visual Studio. So just through the Tools menu and Options inside of Text Editor and transactsql. We'll talk about transactsql in a minute.
How do you edit the table?
So you, just 1 second. So you turn on the line numbers and say, okay, you'll get this panel. So as soon as I fix that, that red mark goes away. Now it'll tell me my syntax is okay, and now I can execute the query. We get our record. You have 2 options to edit the table. You can either run an alter table command here in the query window, or if you want to edit through the visual editor, you just browse to the table on the left, right-click it, and choose Design, and that takes you back into the visual editor. So if you want to change column names, change a data type, add, remove, modify columns, you can do it through the same interface that we use for building the table. Now notice when I went in here, it said transactsql. Anybody have any idea what that is? What that means? About 90 to 95% of the SQL we'll use with SQL Server is standard SQL. It would be the same as what you've used in MySQL, DB2, or anything else. There are a few differences. So Microsoft has called their version of SQL transactsql or TSQL for short. So I'll show you a few of the commands that are different that you might actually use. Actually, I'll just put in another value here. So if this was a MySQL database and I only wanted to select the first record, how would you do it? What would I add on to this query to just get the first record? Well, let's say it was we want the first record in the table, right? Because ID equals to 1,000 might get deleted. We just want the first record regardless of what the ID is.
So row what?
It's not row, what's the function? You guys haven't been in relational database for a while. Kevin? Right. So if this was a MySQL database, this would give us 1 record. Okay, you can already see Management Studio doesn't like that syntax. So even though that's standard SQL and that will work for most databases, in SQL Server, they have different syntax.
My name column's not showing up when I try to insert.
So they use top and then a number. So that'll give us the first record only, regardless of what the ID is. So there are a few other subtle differences between transactsql and what you're used to using. This is probably the one that you would use the most frequently, where things are different. Okay. But things like joins, where clauses, order by, all of that stuff is the same. And the syntax for doing insert, update, delete, and select. Okay. So if you put in an SQL command you think is going to work, and Management Studio complains, that's a hint that probably in transactsql, there's a slightly different version of it. Hayden?
Are we gonna link this database or data to Visual Studio?
We won't with this one. I've got another full one that has 4 related tables. We'll use that one. I wanted just to show you a couple of the other neat features in here. we've got these buttons here that say display estimated execution path and include actual execution path. I'm going to turn that on and run my query again. So when I turn that on and execute the query, we get our results, we get any messages, but we also get this, which is extremely useful. What's this execution plan showing us?
Exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's showing us every step involved in that query, and it also shows us, what do you think the percentages are, the cost percentage?
How much of the time it takes?
Yeah, how much of the resource and the time, how much memory usage and time is being taken up by each part of the query. So if we have a web app, a page, where we have a really complicated query and people are reporting that that page is taking too long, we can run the query through here, turn on the execution plan, and try and identify any bottlenecks and figure out if there's a way we can optimize that query to make it run faster. So we won't notice any difference right now querying one table with one concurrent user, but if we're writing a query where we're joining 10 tables together or writing a whole bunch of queries all in one and we've got hundreds or thousands of concurrent users, this makes a huge difference. So it shows us, we can see not only the actual, but it also we can show the estimated. So this is what it projects it will be. So this is really helpful in terms of optimizing performance of our application. So once we get to sort of really complicated queries or we get a lot of users, we use this a lot for performance tuning. You can see why. One of the other tools that's in here is the ability to import and export data. So if I click on my database and choose tasks, if I import some data, you don't have to do this, I'm just going to show you what this looks like. I've got lots of options as to where my data is going to come from. Right, so I can import from another SQL Server database, I can import from Oracle, Access, or some MySQL, or something like a flat file. So if we have a CSV, which is really common, somebody exports data from their database, they want to give it to us, they'll dump it into a CSV or an Excel file. So I can just go and choose any Excel file on my computer. Let's see if I go and browse to
How
some.
come it only supported Excel 97 to 2003?
Because this is, it will support, because this is 2008, it will still allow me to. So if I just find an Excel file on here. Oh, that's not a good example. Let's see. So I could browse to an Excel file. It asks me whether there's column names in the first row. What database do I want to import it to? It makes me log in. So I want to import it into my database called test. I can either say copy everything, or I want to write a query to filter out what gets imported. It'll copy it into a new table there. And it'll run through, so it gave me 20 rows. And now if I go back to my list of tables and refresh, here's my data. So really easy to move stuff back and forth. And I've worked on many applications over the years where a bunch of the data that we want is being published on other websites, like particularly government sites. And on most of those sites, they allow you to take their data and export it to an Excel file or CSV. So we would regularly scrape those sites, generate CSVs or Excel files, and then we could copy that data into our application. Really simple. We can also export the same way. So if we've got an e-commerce site and our client says, hey, I need an Excel spreadsheet of all of my products because maybe I want to change all the pricing. So could you give me a list? We can easily just generate something, or we want to run a query. I had somebody do this last week saying, I want to see of all the users that signed up for my site, how many of them have gone through my whole process, how many of them signed up and never did anything, and how many of them quit partway through. So I would just went into here and wrote a view, created a query, and grabbed this, and I could export that query to an Excel file. Here you go. So it's really handy to have that functionality for moving data.
And then did you import it back in when they changed stuff?
In that case, I didn't, but yeah, I have. So oftentimes they'll say, I don't want to go in and update one record at a time. Give me an Excel file so I can update it, and then I'll send it back to you. And exactly, I want you to then import the Excel file back with all of my changes. So that import-export wizard takes all the manual work out of that. I'm also just going to show you, let's run a backup on the database, because this is typically how we would take a local database and put it up on a web server. Okay? So we have a database. First of all, we want to take a backup. So if we right-click on our database and choose Tasks, we've got Backup. So it creates a backup set for us. It also gives us an option. If there's already an existing backup, we can say overwrite the existing backup or just append the new data on, whatever way we want to do it. So I'll just click OK. It doesn't take very long. And if I go back into my SQL Server directory, the data directory holds all the files. If I go up one level, this by default is the backup. So it creates a BAK file. So it's a compressed version, right? This is only 1.5 MB. Our actual data file is 6 megs now. So it compresses it down. So if we then wanted to take this and deploy the database to a live web server, well, we have a couple ways of doing it. One is we could use the import and export wizard and say export from our local server to the live server, and that would copy everything. Or we can take a backup, and this is typically how I would do it. I would then take that BAK file and upload it to the web server, upload it to a directory on the web server, and then I'd log into my web host and go into my database management. And if I wanted to restore that backup onto the web server, there's usually an import wizard. So it would say, okay, somewhere on here there should be a BAK file, and I could just click on that BAK file and restore that database to the server. Same if I wanted to pull my web host takes nightly backups, so if I want to take the live database and download a BAK file, in fact, I could do that. So I'm going to download one of these. It'll save it with a BAK extension. If I dump it in my backup directory, I can then restore it. And then I'll have a local copy of that. So I'll dump it there. And if I just make a new blank database, I should be able to restore from that backup. So if I choose Tasks and Restore, I can browse into my backup folder. It should take me in there. So here's my backup. And I'll say, oops. So from that backup on this day, I want to overwrite my existing blank database. It'll take a bit because there's a whole bunch of tables and procedures and functions rolled in there. It tells me my database was restored. And now if I refresh it, here's all my tables, all of my functions and procedures. So that wizard's pretty easy to move our database around. And if I wanted somebody, was going to have somebody in here do some of the work, I could give you the BAK file. You could walk through that wizard on your own machine, and then you've got your own local copy, so you could work on one piece of the application, I could work on another piece. So one of the nice things is basically you get to play around at being database administrator with these tools. You're doing more than just setting up the tables and building the applications. You actually get some experience in managing the databases as well. I don't know if anybody's that interested in being a database administrator. Fantastic way to earn a living. Typical salaries, I think, are somewhere in the very high 5 figures, if not higher, for DBAs.
I got the blue screen of death.
Ah, you broke it. Restart.
I didn't do anything.
That's all you can do.
That's the problem, you didn't do anything.
Okay. So here's what I'd like us to try to do. I think I've given you a script here. If everybody can log into your Azure accounts. So go to manage.windowsazure.com.
Can't go anywhere yet.
So what we're going to do, we're going to try to create a blank database online. There's really no tool within Azure to manage the database. We really need to use Management Studio. And with each of your accounts, each of you can create 2 SQL Server databases. So here's what I would suggest. I'm going to suggest, you can just use one for everything, or you can create one database for use in class and then a separate one for doing all your assignments. Really doesn't matter. You have the freedom to create 2. So if you go into SQL databases on the left, I'm not going to be able to create another one, but you guys can. So if you click on New, yeah, see, I don't have the option to create more. So you should have a window which allows you to create a new database.
Quick create or custom?
Choose Quick Create. And it will prompt you to name the database. So name it whatever you like. You could name it COMP2007, or you could name it with your student number. And it will also prompt you for a database administrator username and password. So you're creating your own credentials.
How is the Azure Pass going to be on for?
I think it's 180 days.
What's the password?
You create your own. It should prompt you to give a database name. Okay, hang on a second.
I've got database name, subscription, server.
The server you should just be able to select from a list. You shouldn't have to provide the server.
Is that to the server or a new server?
It really doesn't matter. You can use an existing server, or you can choose one from the list. There's probably only one in the list.
So we should have one for lessons and one for assignments.
You could, or you can just use one for everything. You get 2 maximum.
You have that for underscores.
Not what our region is?
You may as well pick North Central US as the region. Mike, the answer is I'm not sure whether I think you can probably have both dashes and underscores in the name. So my suggestion is to create one for use in class, and then you can create a separate one for when you're doing assignments.
Is this how you get there? Through a website?
Okay, you need to go to manage.windowsazure.com.
Which I did.
Okay, so log in to manage.windowsazure.com. You need to log in with your Microsoft login, it won't be your student email, or it won't be your student login. It has to be the same credential you used when I gave you the Microsoft Azure Pass.
What is it? Where can I
You
find it?
made this.
You created it. And I said to you, you have to create your own credential. It's your own account that I have no access to. So please make a note of all of the database credentials, because again, you're creating your own username and password for your database. I don't have access to this. So create a text file or create a note in your email with your database credentials. And eventually, when you click on SQL databases, it should take a few minutes and it will show you when your database is online. Has anybody got a database online yet? Does anybody see this? A few of you have it? Okay, just kind of give me a nod when you have it done. I'll give everybody a chance to do it.
Sorry, for the settings, was there anything specific put in there? For the
No, you can just choose the defaults,
Okay.
Daniel, but you have to name the database and you provide a username and password.
Yeah.
So make note of those somewhere,
Okay.
preferably in your email or OneDrive or somewhere, so whenever you jump on a computer, you have access to those. It's online? Okay. So I've already created one called COMP2007. So it shows quite a bit. There's something we're going to have to do in here. So it shows you connections. There's all kinds of configuration and performance monitoring tools that you have access to. It shows you, there's a link that says show connection strings. So it actually shows you how to connect from ASP.NET or how to connect from PHP or a Java application. The other thing we're going to have to set up by default on Azure, all of the databases are set to block external connections. So what we need to do, once your database is online, we need to set the firewall rules. So if you click on your database name, I'm going to use this one called Contoso. When you click on it, you get this similar screen to this. And if you scroll down, over here on the right, there's a link that says Manage Allowed IP Addresses. By default, there are no remote IPs allowed. The only application that can access this is one that's hosted on Azure. We want to be able to connect from anywhere to our database. So click on that link that says Manage Allowed IP Addresses. And what the easiest thing to do is just allow every IP. That way also if you're working from home, wherever you are, you'll be able to get in. So under the rule name, you can just put on anything. You can just call it like all clients. Doesn't matter. As the start, put in 0.0.0.0, and as the end, 255.255.255. This will allow your IP address in no matter where you are. And then click the Save button. So there's a big Save button down at the bottom.
Okay, so I'm.
So from all zeros to all 255s. And you just give it a name. Alex?
How do you get into firewall? How do you get into firewall?
SQL databases, create SQL database.
So your database is, were you able to create the database already?
Yeah.
And it shows online here?
Never mind, yeah, it was created, so.
Okay, so just click on it, Alex. Just click on your database once it's online. And then just scroll down this screen. It says Quick Glance at the top, and there's a few links. And it's the last of those links on the right. It says Manage Allowed IP Addresses.
So standard, and you said the new SQL database?
Yep.
Yeah. Login name.
So set 0.0.0.0 as the start and 255.255.255.255 is the end. All IPs will be in that range, so you've allowed everything.
Sorry, and the rule name, the city? name?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
North US, East US,
Doesn't matter.
doesn't matter the region?
It doesn't matter. So now we should have a blank database hosted on Azure. So what we want to do is see if we can connect from Management Studio to our database. So I'm going to go back to Management Studio. So this is our local server. So you might have this tab at the bottom. Probably this tab is enabled that says Object Explorer. You can see down at the bottom left. There's a disabled tab beside it called Registered Servers. Let's click on that one. And we should get this. So this is how we can add remote databases into Management Studio so we can connect and access other databases. So I already have a bunch. If I expand where it says Database Engine, I already have a bunch of groups, so these are different hosts. So I already have Azure here, but I'll add it again. So what I'm going to do, where it says local server groups, Mike?
There by default, so I go to view.
Yeah, you may have to click on View and Registered Servers in order to get that tab. So if you don't see Registered Servers down here on the bottom left, click on the View menu and Registered Servers. This should be, I think, the 4th item in that list. This will allow us to register another server besides our local one.
Registered server.
Yep.
Okay.
So you should see Database Engine, which you can expand. And then I think you'll get an option by default that says Local Server Groups. Do you guys have that on yours as well?
Yep.
So I've added additional groups in mine. You won't have, I think you'll have the local group, which is your local server. So I'm going to right-click Local Server Groups and choose New Server Registration. Now you'll need the server name from Azure to go in here. So I'm going to go back to my Azure panel. And right down below where we click the Manage Allowed IP Addresses, here's the server name.
Okay. Where's
So I'm just going to grab that server name, copy it. So it'll be some kind of random string .database.windows.net.
where's this managed now? I finally got this thing up.
So I'm going to paste that in. The authentication, we're not using Windows authentication to connect to our Azure database. We need SQL Server authentication. And you need to enter the username and password you created when you created your database. Okay, so whatever Azure credentials you provided, put them in here.
0000
And under the registered server name, this is just a friendly name, so you can leave this if you like, or you could give it a descriptive name. Like you can call it,
Was it
Azure.
455? 4255?
All 255s in the end, all zeros in the start.
All 255.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if we click the test button down here at the bottom, it will try to connect. And hopefully you should get that little chime rather than a honking sound and a big red X.
How do I save?
There should be a save button at the bottom. So now if I click the save button beside test, it's added my server here. And if I just double click it, we should now be connected. And we should be able to fully manage the database through Management Studio. Then again, we might not. Let's try and see.
Freezing up.
Now I have to check whether this is a firewall issue or we may have to add something. It's weird, interesting that when I click, yours worked? It's interesting when I click test, I'm going to edit the properties for a minute. I'm going to try putting in the port in the server name. That may make a difference. The default port for SQL Server is 1433. I'm going to try that. See if that makes a difference. Now I'm on the wireless network. I'm going to maybe try it wired if it doesn't work. So was anybody able to connect besides Casio? Kevin, you were? I'm going to try on the wired network and see if that makes a difference.
Where do I grab the server name from?
It's just below the IP address link. Casio and Kevin, can you guys please email me your server name? I want to send that to IT. Just send me a quick email and give me your server name, please. Because they will have to look at the firewall rule, so that'll help if they know, if I can point them that some of these are working and some of them aren't.
The connection was established, but an error occurred.
Yeah, I got the same thing.
Okay.
Got in, but it broke.
Well, I'm also going to see if I can connect through Visual Studio.
This is TCP provider, specific network name.
Yeah, I'm getting the same issue. I had it happen the other day where I couldn't connect through Management Studio, but I could through Visual Studio. And if we can do it there, I'm just going to give that a try. We can always run our queries to populate the database there. Connection timed out? Okay. I'm going to send it to IT. We can always work on a local database for today if we need to. I'm just curious to see what will happen. Okay. All right, well, that's a good place for us to take a pause.